The river ran low that season, thin as a worn strap, its banks scraped bare by early frost, and the tramp of men who had followed its bends for peltry and little else. Alder and willow clung to the margins where the water still held dark, slow tongues, and beyond them the grass gave way to hard, wind-scraped earth and sage that rasped beneath the hooves of passing mules. The Wind River Range rose to the west like a broken wall of pale stone, its high crowns already veiled in a skin of winter, while the sky above lay stretched and colorless, a bleached hide drawn tight over a country that made no allowance for the careless or the hopeful. In such a place, men did not speak lightly of miracles, nor did they place stock in parchment promises. Their faith, if any remained, was hammered into them by the rhythm of rivers and the slow arithmetic of survival. Powder kept dry, steel kept sharp, meat taken when it could be found, and never, under any circumstance, a trail trusted simply because it had been inked by a hand that had never felt this wind. It was into this gathering rough tents pitched ragged along the river, smoke dragging low and sour through the cold air that he came. He drew no notice at first. A solitary figure, moving with the practiced discretion of a man long accustomed to arriving unseen, he led his mule apart from the louder knots of trappers and chose a place where the ground sloped gently toward the water. He was neither young nor yet broken by age, his face weathered to the hue of old leather, eyes narrowed by years spent reading the far line of horizon for danger or game. His clothing bore no mark of company or allegiance. No trade beads hung upon him. No easy humor softened the set of his mouth. He moved with the quiet purpose of one who had long ago learned that solitude was less treacherous than men. Among the assembled trappers he was known only in fragments. Some had seen him once along the Sweetwater. Others remembered a figure, wintering alone, near the Popo Agi, where no sensible man chose to remain past the first heavy snow. His name was spoken rarely, and when it was, it carried no warmth. He was a presence at the margins, a man who kept distance from the careless fraternity of rendezvous, neither celebrating nor lamenting, but observing as if the world around him were part of some longer tally he alone understood. It was the map that drew the eye of the camp. He sat apart from the fires and produced it only when the day had bled thin and men, lulled by smoke and the low murmur of exhausted conversation, had begun to drift in slow circles of talk. From the inner fold of his coat he withdrew a strip of mottled vellum, brittle at the edges, scuffed by time and travel. It was not the neat drafting of a government survey, nor the crude scrawl of a hopeful greenhorn. The script upon it was narrow and precise, written in a Spanish hand of a careful ecclesiastical cast. Small crosses marked its corners, faded, ink-traced angular lines that suggested ridges, narrow passes, and the looping path of a river not named by any known American tongue. Beside these markings lay faint impressions of Jesuit symbology, familiar to none present, save, perhaps, by rumor, subtle references to saints and pilgrimage, coupled incongruously with notations of mineral presence, shaded marks that seemed to indicate interior veins, claims, or workings hidden west of the range. He said little of how it had come into his possession. When at last its presence drew the boulder among the camp to him, he held it neither proudly nor timidly, but as a man might hold an old wound with knowledge and constraint. Those gathered leaned close, squinting into the failing light. A laugh broke among them, short and dry, followed by another. A trapper with frost-split hands and a ribald mouth pointed his chin toward the ridges faintly outlined on the skin. "Spanish foolery," he said. "A priest's dream. Ain't no silver left in this country but in a man's teeth if he still got any." Another spat into the dust. "Every spring there's one comes in with paper telling him the world owes him wealth. Winter finds his bones west of nowhere." Their voices carried no malice, only the fatigue of men long betrayed by stories. He did not rise to defend the artifact, nor did he attempt to convince them. His gaze moved from hand to hand, as if measuring the calloused texture of their skepticism. When a young runner, fresh from St. Louis and still clinging to a notion of wonders, bent close and traced one finger along the script, the older men slapped it away as if the vellum carried contagion. "Those Jesuits went broke 2 lifetimes ago," a voice muttered near the fire. "Ain't no crosses guiding anybody through the Wind River's teeth." Yet the protagonist studied the lines as though they spoke a language more faithful than any gathered witness. He had followed rivers where no name had yet settled. He had walked trails worn first by hooves, bearing saddles stamped with Spanish iron. He had heard whispered accounts from half-broken men speaking of abandoned adits buried beneath snow and creekstone, of ore veins struck and lost again before the American flag had ever dreamed of that horizon. To him, the map was not prophecy. It was a memory. That night, while the camp slept in uneasy silence punctuated by coughing and the clank of loosening harness, he unfolded the vellum beneath moonlight and traced every marking with precision born of necessity. He noted the curvature of lines where the hand had hesitated, observed ink thickened where the pen had paused in contemplation. These were not the flourishes of a fantasist. They were the careful lines of a man navigating known danger, a man who feared the unknown and yet pressed onward regardless. Beyond the last marked ridge lay the faint symbol of a small chapel, its shape eroded by passing years, and beside it a notation written in an older orthography, referencing plata and Honda, profundidad, silver, and deep burden. Lines radiated outward as if indicating subterranean reach, then faded abruptly, as though the writer had ceased or the record had been forcibly ended. In the morning, when the camp stirred, the velvet quiet of dawn fractured again with rough voices. Men emerged stiff and half-cursed into the pale air, dusted with frost and old bourbon. The map remained the unspoken curiosity of the night, now reduced again to the status of folly. As they saddled and loaded, their focus returned to pelts, provisions, and the next known trail, the only truths they trusted. The protagonist said nothing further, but as he turned westward, mule hooves striking dull rhythms against frozen ground, the contours of the vellum burned in his memory like the quiet outline of something half-remembered from another life. He knew how this land deceived, how ridges swallowed men and rivers stole their names. Yet he also understood that beneath its indifference lay histories not yet answered by rifle or axe. The others watched him leave with a measure of pity, as men observe someone already lost. Not one called after him with encouragement. Not one offered to join his path. They did not believe in his map. They believed in what they had seen, and what they had seen had killed every man who thought ink stronger than stone. And so he moved onward alone toward the wall of mountains and the story that no one in that camp would live to believe. The land changed first in its silence. The farther he pressed from the green, the more the earth seemed to withdraw its voice. The wind came thinner. The grasses lay flattened as if a slow hand had passed over them. And in the long stretch between dry ravines and stone-scorched rises, he began to notice what no talkative camp would have allowed him to hear: the ghost movement of watchful people who made no announcement of their presence. He had entered ground long understood by the crow. Their sign was not the loud arrogance of claim stakes or the boastful smoke of careless fires, but the subtle alteration of things. A branch bent just enough to mark passage, ash cooled and scattered, feathers pressed half-buried into river sand. He did not pretend ignorance. Among mountain men, respect was sometimes given in the simple act of not offending prematurely. He slowed his mule, observed the angles of the ridges, and made camp with deliberate economy, as if every motion were being measured by unseen eyes, which it was. They came to him without threat. It was an elder first, his face carved by years into solemn lines, eyes level and calculating. 3 younger warriors followed, moving with the soft precision of men who treated the ground as a living surface. Their dress showed no urgency of war, no raised paint, no drawn hostility, but each carried at his side a bow so visibly malformed that for a moment the trapper believed his eyes had deceived him. The limbs twisted subtly away from one another, maximizing curvature, tightened along asymmetrical arcs that no white craftsman would have tolerated in his own shop. The wood bore sinew backing where it should not, by Eastern logic. Horn at its tips glinted pale beneath stained hide binding. To the untrained eye, it looked a condemned weapon. to him it was something else entirely, an unfamiliar grammar written in tension and curve. The elder spoke in Crow, his voice even, patient, as if offering no challenge but no submission either. Through sign and sparse shared trade tongue he gestured toward the bow, holding it high so the trapper might study its broken form fully. Then the warrior stepped away alone and chose a point on a distant ridge where a knot of dead bark clung pale against the trunk of a leaning pine. The range was long, beyond sensible musket measure. The young warrior knelt. No announcement preceded his draw, no bark of powder, no angry plume of smoke. Only the low whisper of sinew and limb drawing into stored force, and then the softest release. The arrow passed soundless through the air and struck with a dull precision, burying its head deep into the wood. The pine trembled faintly around it. No concussion, no misfire, nothing announcing violence to the far world. They repeated the motion twice more. Each shaft struck within a hand's width of the first. Even the mule shifted uneasily, sensing in some animal fashion that this silence held danger more intimate than any rifle's roar. The elder nodded once, as though confirming not superiority, but inevitability. In rough, deliberate words shared between worlds, he spoke. "Your guns speak," he said, tapping the air outward. "These listen." The trapper understood enough. He had known rifles fail under cold rain, powder clump like dead flour within the pan, percussion caps shatter from frost as brittle as glass. He had known the cruel delay between aim and ignition when moisture crept unseen into the charge. Now before him stood a weapon answering neither season nor dampness, only the steady comprehension of its handler. The Crow did not trade it, nor offer it. They allowed him to observe its construction as a gesture of measured tolerance, the careful layering of sinew along the back, dried and reapplied in rhythm with season, the precise horn placement to guide strain, the deliberate imbalance which forced stored energy into swift correction upon release. This was no accident. It was knowledge carried through hands across generations, survival taught without written record or foreign sermon. As dusk crept forward, the elder regarded the vellum that lay folded at the edge of the trapper's bedroll. He made no mockery of it, only indicated its direction west and gave a quiet sound that suggested old memory rather than fear. "Men with crosses once passed this way," the elder said slowly. "They dug and sang to the earth. Then they did not return." A strange alignment settled into the silence, the map in his coat, the bow before his eyes, two testimonies of worlds that white men had long failed to interpret, ink and sinew, faith and tension, both overlooked by those who trusted only noise. Before first light the Crow departed without ceremony. The trapper woke to empty ground where they had stood, arrows removed, nothing left but faint impressions that even the rising sun soon erased. Only the knowledge remained. He rose, packed in quiet order, and turned again westward. And as his path lifted into the harder lines of the foothills, he carried with him not just the relic of forgotten men, but the certainty that what others named broken was often merely misunderstood by those who had never lived long enough to learn the land's subtler language. The cold did not arrive as a sudden scourge, but as a slow and deliberate tightening of the world. Each morning brought a sharper edge to the air, a brittle glaze upon grass and stone, and a thin film of ice that crept silently over creek and ford. The mule's breath hung pale and heavy before its nostrils. The trapper's own exhalations rose and shattered like ghost smoke against the low, indifferent sky. This was the season in which mistakes were not forgiven, only recorded in bone and silence. By the time he entered the long emptiness along the Powder River, the land had taken on that peculiar stillness known only to men who had wintered beyond the margin of comfort. No bird stirred, no leaf turned. The earth itself seemed to listen. He first noticed the disturbance where the snow lay churned and torn, revealing dark soil beneath. There were scattered traces of trampled sage, a snapped lance shaft, and the torn skin of a pack mule frozen stiff as rawhide. The pattern spoke plainly enough, a crossing gone wrong. A meeting of men without agreement. He crouched and studied the ground. Boot prints overlapped with the lighter imprints of moccasins. Drag marks suggested weight pulled hurriedly across the crusted surface. A spread of dried blood had turned almost black in the cold. He needed no second reading. Blackfeet. He had scarcely straightened when distant voices carried faintly over the low ridges, harsh, anxious tones. White men, and too many of them speaking at once. He moved instinctively toward a thread of timber and low rock, placing the ground between himself and whatever now unfolded ahead. The first crack of rifle fire split the stillness with abrupt violence. Smoke burst pale and clumsy into the frozen air, hanging like torn cloud before drifting away. 2 more shots followed, then the hollow click of misfire, sharp and final as a judgment. The Blackfeet emerged without rush, their approach measured, their movements fluid as though guided by memory older than any map or boundary. Some rode. Others advanced on foot, bows already partially drawn, eyes fixed and unwavering. They did not shout. They did not charge blindly. They moved as men who already knew the conclusion of what had begun. A trapper attempted to fire again. His pan flashed but did not take. Another tore at his powder horn in frantic haste, spilling charge uselessly onto frozen ground. Their noise betrayed them with every breath, every shouted command, every desperate oath hurled into the air. The arrows came level and true. One sank into a shoulder as cleanly as a blade into meat. Another struck low, beneath coat and ribs, folding its mark in silence. The Blackfeet did not linger their gaze. Each shaft carried intention, consequence, and restraint. The trapper watched from his place of concealment, understanding without satisfaction what this harsh lesson revealed. Powder, choked by damp air and numbed hands, betrayed its master. Steel, when slowed by cold and hesitation, became only weight. Against these forces stood the bow unbothered by frost or restlessness, obedient solely to the strength and knowledge of the man who drew it. The skirmish lasted only minutes. Had rifles answered as intended, it might have stretched longer, punishing both sides, but winter showed its preference quickly. Those who depended upon thunder fell first, those who moved with silence remained standing. When it ended, the Blackfeet did not linger to gloat, nor linger in needless cruelty. They gathered what they had lost, recovered arrows where possible, and withdrew as they had come, leaving the ground quiet once more beneath the pale stretch of winter sky. The trapper waited until the last silhouette vanished beyond the bend of land and timber. Only then did he rise and move cautiously forward, boots crunching against ice that no longer pretended softness. He came upon 3 men still breathing, and 2 already beyond need. Words passed slowly, broken sentences, requests for water. He knelt, offered what binding and spare cloth he could afford, though he understood well enough that some wounds neither prayer nor skill could mend. One young man clutched at his sleeve with trembling fingers. "Why didn't they fail?" he asked hoarsely, eyes hollow with shock. Why did their bows still hold true? The trapper did not answer. There was no instruction that could undo what winter and arrogance had taught more entirely than words ever could. When the last groan faded and the wounded either steadied or stilled, he withdrew again toward higher ground, leaving the survivors to their own reckonings. He knew better than to remain where blood summoned more than men. He reached a low ridge as evening bled thin and colorless across the basin. There he knelt and built a small fire with care sufficient for warmth, but not signal. The mule huddled close, its flank pressed near his own stillness. He rested his rifle across his knees and regarded it without affection or blame. It was not a poor tool, only an imperfect one, in a world that punished delay. In memory rose again the smooth arc of the crow, bow, the calm hand upon its grip, the whisper of released sinew that had carried death farther than any pan-fired noise could promise. He understood now that what white men called progress did not always survive the land it sought to tame. From his coat he drew the vellum once more, letting its brittle expanse unfold in the low glow of dying embers. The lines were no longer absurd. They had acquired a weight that silence alone could grant. The marks of forgotten men no longer read as fantasy, but as quiet footprint upon soil that remembered more than any trader's ledger. He studied the direction again. The faint chapel mark, the suggestion of depth and silver where the Spanish hand had once hesitated. Beyond that, Only the mountains waited. He folded the map carefully and returned it to his coat. The fire dwindled. The bitter air crept closer around him, but his resolve held steady. Somewhere out across the distant hills, a wolf called once, not in hunger, but in claim, and the sound carried unbroken through the frozen dark. He listened, understanding at last what those at the rendezvous had not. Stone endured, silence endured, and only those who learned their manner might walk a little farther before the land reclaimed them. The mountains did not reveal themselves at once. They rose first as a dim, pale suggestion along the western horizon, a broken escarpment of stone and shadow that grew gradually more defined with each mile the trapper advanced. Snow crowned their upper slopes in thin, hard sheets, while their lower faces folded into dark timber and hidden ravines where light surrendered early and without protest. It was a landscape that spoke not of welcome but of endurance, and he entered it with the steady caution of a man stepping into old memory rather than new discovery. Each day's passage narrowed his world. The wide openness of the plains gave way to steep-walled draws and winding gulches cut deep into the earth like scars left by forgotten violence. The trapper moved slowly now, attentive to every change in slope and stone, aligning each ridge, crest, and bend of water against the silent geometry etched upon his vellum. What had once seemed uncertain now assumed a reluctant familiarity. The lines of the map and the shape of the land spoke together in quiet agreement. A narrow defile opened before him, where dark shale split beneath lichen and frost. A stream issued thin and veiled from its depth, vanishing again beneath the tangled roots of spruce. He halted, studying the marking upon the skin. A faint notch, barely visible, corresponded with the rise ahead, the same shallow arc that curved between two obscure elevation lines on the map. He moved forward without haste, testing the ground with care. As he climbed, the air thinned and cooled further, scented faintly with resin and wet stone. Each breath came sharper, measured. He passed beneath wind-gnarled pines, whose trunks twisted in slow, patient defiance, their bark stripped thin by years of ice and solitude. Here man had no dominion, only temporary passage. Midway along the ascent, he found the first undeniable sign that others had traveled this route long before him. Half buried beneath scree and moss lay the faint outline of a shallow cut too narrow and deliberate to be cattle trail or animal run. The path curved faintly upward, stone edges worn smooth not by hooves but by repeated human tread. He knelt and brushed snow away from its margin, revealing stonework softened by time yet bearing faint memory of purpose. Further on, beneath a leaning outcrop, he discovered a shallow depression ringed by darker soil. Within it lay the rusted ghost of iron, its form eroded and twisted, possibly a mule shoe, possibly the remnant of some pack saddle ring. He did not touch it, he only observed. This ground remembered. Higher still, the forest thinned, revealing stretches of open rock where the wind howled unhindered across ancient granite. Here the map revealed another feint, marking a small cross near a crooked line that suggested passage between two steep stone shoulders. His eyes traced the land before him and found it a tight cleft running diagonally upward, sheltered just enough from drifting snow to allow cautious passage. He entered it, leading the mule with slow patience, trusting neither stone nor silence too readily. The narrow walls rose on either side, close enough to swallow sound. It felt less like a trail than a confession made reluctantly by the earth. Near its upper end, where the cliff widened and the slope eased slightly, he saw it. Carved faintly into the face of the rock stood a symbol neither natural nor accidental, a cross, simple and worn, flanked by weathered etchings almost continental in shape. Beneath it lay faint script, long eroded to illegibility, but unmistakably human in its effort. He removed his hat, not as an act of reverence, but of acknowledgment. This place bore weight beyond market, value. It carried the breath of forgotten men who had climbed this harsh spine of the continent in pursuit of faith, wealth, or absolution. Priests whose sermons had echoed briefly against these walls before vanishing into echo and snow. Men who had prayed as they mined, and mined as they prayed, until the land at last erased them. He stood in silence, letting the wind pass over the carving without interruption. The vellum lay against his palm, its brittle fibers answering the stone with quiet confirmation. The map had not lied. It had only waited for someone patient enough to believe it without worshipping it. Beyond the narrow pass, the ground sloped downward into a concealed basin veiled by timber and shadow. He descended cautiously, conscious that discovery did not mean safety. Beneath the muffled hush of pine and frost, he began to notice further traces mule droppings fossilized by age, faint impressions of pack sled runners, and shallow heaps of discarded stone gathered in careful, deliberate rows. Then he saw the opening. It lay tucked into the flank of the mountain like a wound the earth had chosen not to heal. Dark, silent, framed by timbers long ago rotted into mere suggestion, within its mouth gaped a narrow adit, its interior swallowing what little light dared approach. He stood before it without entering. Here was the place that maps wrote softly about and men laughed at, a laboring trace of old empire buried beneath the indifference of stone and time. No glitter announced it. No fortune lay visible at its threshold. Only cold breath issuing faintly from within, as though the deep earth still exhaled the memory of prayer. He did not yet step inside. Some frontiers demanded more than certainty. They demanded restraint. He turned his gaze instead across the basin, the untouched slopes, the silent timber, the untouched sweep of snow. The world appeared unchanged by the old intrusion, as though it had chosen to endure rather than remember. Only, he remembered. And he knew now, without question, that the story mocked at the rendezvous fire had been carved in truth long before his feet ever disturbed its silence. He did not remain long at the mine mouth. The mountain exhaled a faint chill from its depths, a slow breath that carried with it the scent of damp stone and ancient labor. He knew well enough that to rush such a place was to invite misfortune. So he turned instead from the dark opening and made his way along the basin's narrow rim, where the ground lay broken by fallen timber and tangled brush, seeking level earth where night might settle without threat. There, beneath the shelter of a heavy-boughed pine, he made a small fire and let its glow fall only faintly upon the surrounding stone. The mule stood near, its ears twitching at distant, indistinct sounds that carried through the hollow. Above, the mountain slopes loomed dark and indifferent, as if this narrow valley were merely an accidental crease in something far larger than man or memory. It was there, as the fire burned low and the air grew sharper, that the crow came again. He heard them before he saw them, not by footfall, but by the subtle change in silence, as though the night itself had drawn inward. Shapes emerged from the shadowed timber with careful economy, two this time. One younger, one visibly older, their posture composed, unhurried. Neither carried overt sign of hostility. Each bore a bow across his shoulder, the warped silhouette unmistakable even in the faint glow. The elder inclined his head in acknowledgment. The trapper returned the gesture without standing. There was no need for formality. Two men, each long acquainted with the weight of restraint, required few unnecessary movements. They sat opposite the small fire, just beyond its strongest warmth. The younger warrior placed his bow gently upon the ground between them, as though laying down something sacred rather than merely useful. The elder spoke softly in crow, his words slow, deliberate, shaped by years rather than haste. Through gesture and fragmented trade tongue, his meaning emerged with careful gravity. "This bow is not broken," he said. "It is taut." The trapper watched as the younger man lifted it with reverence and turned it so that its asymmetry stood clearly revealed. The inward curve of its limbs, the unequal tension between upper and lower stave, the thick layering of sinew and the smooth polish of horn, all of it seemed now less a tool than a living expression of knowledge passed hand to hand across generations. They showed him its making. In measured gestures and quiet explanation, the elder traced the bow's origin. He spoke of wood chosen while still living, cut only in the season of slow sap. Of sinew harvested, prepared, layered patiently over weeks until muscle and tree spoke the same language of tension. of horn bound at the tips, not for ornament, but to guide the release of stored strength into clean, unerring flight. The bow did not shout like a rifle. It breathed, it whispered, and within that whisper traveled death so precise it seemed an extension of the warrior's own intention. The trapper understood the depth of this knowledge not as curiosity, but as humility. He had crafted tools his whole life, trusted to his hands the shaping of iron, wood, and leather. But here was craft woven so completely into survival that its very form defied white logic. What another would call faulty, the crow had made sovereign. The elder gestured toward the dark mouth of the mine far up the slope. "Men who prayed came here," he said simply. "They cut the mountain, they sang for it to give. But the mountain sings its own song." The younger warrior then rose and demonstrated slow movements with the bow, as one might show a child the handling of something both fragile and deadly. His draw came smooth as river water, his release as quiet as the fall of snow. Each motion possessed a calm inevitability that spoke not of anger, but of understanding. "Silence keeps you alive," the elder added. "Noise tells the world where to find you." The trapper glanced toward his rifle resting beside his bedroll. He did not remove it, he did not defend it. He merely acknowledged the truth carried in those simple words. The night passed in low exchange, sparse phrases bridged across cultures, firelight flickering gently against carved bows and weathered faces. They did not speak of trade. They did not ask his purpose, nor question the map that guided him. They accepted his presence as a man accepts the passing of weather, with awareness, but without interference. Before dawn they stood. The elder retrieved the bow and placed his hand briefly upon the trapper's shoulder, not as ownership, but as recognition. "You listen," he said. "Not many do." Then they departed as they had arrived, dissolving into the timber with such quiet that only absence confirmed they had ever been there. The trapper remained seated until the eastern sky grayed faintly behind the ridge. He stared once more toward the abandoned mine, and understood now that his path forward demanded more than stubborn will. He rose slowly and packed with deliberate care. Every essential inspected, every strap tightened, powder horn sealed, knife secured. He moved as a man preparing not only for distance, but for significance. When at last he approached the mine mouth again, the night's stillness clung to its threshold. Cold air flowed outward in steady breath. He paused before crossing, listening once more, not for danger alone, but for the quiet instruction of land and stone. He thought of the bow, of the men who shaped silence into power, of the whispered knowledge that had outlasted empire and map alike. Then, with steady step and unforced resolve, he entered the darkness, carrying with him not thunder, but patience. The first few yards swallowed him whole. Light faltered almost at once, thinning to a pale memory behind his shoulders as the mountain drew its cold breath around him. Moist stone pressed close on either side, its surface slick with the slow weeping of mineral water. The air carried the odor of old earth and decay, touched faintly by the metallic ghost of ore long disturbed. Each sound answered itself, the scrape of his boot, the faint brush of cloth returned to him as dampening echoes, as if the tunnel resented intrusion but no longer possessed strength to resist it. He moved forward carefully, hand-grazing the rough timber supports that had once crowded this narrow passage with human intent. Some beams still held, warped yet stubborn. Others sagged or split, bowing under the accumulated patience of centuries. He knew enough to read these warnings and stepped only where stone spoke firm beneath his weight. Further in, his lantern caught faint markings along the wall, shallow channels gouged where tools had bitten again and again into stubborn rock. The strokes bore rhythm, not frantic, methodical. These men had not mined in desperation. They had labored here under discipline, perhaps under prayer, guided by something more rigid than mere greed. He paused where the tunnel widened into a low chamber and let the lantern light travel fully across its rough interior. There, half submerged beneath stone rubble and silty collapse, stood the remains of a crude altar built of chiseled rock. Above it, blackened faintly against the wall, lingered the shadow of a cross. Time had stripped it of privilege. Only form remained. Beside the altar rested fragments of iron tools, snapped and rusted beyond use, and the fragile remnants of rotted leather once shaped by hands, now long consumed by soil. He lowered his head slightly. This was not simply a mine. It had been a site of belief. From this central chamber branched narrower passages, each descending further into silence and unknown strain. He did not explore them all. Instead, he advanced down the most worn, guided by the deeper scoring of stone where pick and hammer had pressed with greatest devotion. The floor grew uneven beneath his step. The air thickened. His breath showed faintly in the glow, pale as the memory of ghosts. At the far limit of the tunnel he found the source of their persistence. Veins of silver ran like frozen lightning through the rock face, pale and luminous in the lantern's trembling glow. Not a fortune haphazardly strewn, but evidence of serious discovery, enough to justify the slow carving of this hidden sanctuary beneath stone and prayer. The Spanish had not imagined this place. They had found it. And in finding it, they had perhaps sealed their final quiet. He stood in silence and let the weight of that knowledge settle upon him. He thought of men who had trudged here guided by vellum and belief, carving scripture and tunnel with equal fervor. He thought of their final days, lungs heavy with dust, hands blistered, voices perhaps lifted once more toward a God whose silence was deeper even than the mountain's own. He knelt and brushed loose stone from one fragment of fallen timber, exposing a small medallion half crushed beneath debris. It bore faint etching of a saint's figure, worn nearly smooth by time. He did not pocket it. He left it where it lay, as one leaves bones undisturbed beneath remembered ground. This knowledge was not meant to be taken lightly. He turned back toward the dim path of exit, understanding now that discovery did not equate to possession. These mines held no promise of rightful claim. They belonged to a history not his own, and a land that did not forgive hasty ambition. As he neared the mouth, a faint breeze stirred the stagnant air and carried with it the muted sound of wind brushing cold pine above the living world, reminding him that time had not halted for forgotten men. He stepped once more into open light. The basin lay unchanged. Snow kept its quiet dominion. The world beyond knew nothing of what rested beneath its surface, and perhaps it need never know. He stood long upon that threshold, looking from the hidden entrance back to the endless reach of untamed slopes and timber. He knew what wealth might mean here, what ruin would follow careless tongues and avaricious hands. Behind him slept silver and prayer. Before him waited silence and choice. He turned away at last, not in defeat, but in measured defiance of the hunger that had claimed so many before him. He mounted his mule and guided it slowly along the edge of the basin, leaving the opening behind, as one leaves a sacred place marked not by ownership, but by restraint. The wind rose faintly upon the ridge, carrying with it the low murmur of distant pines. He listened, as the crow had taught him, and moved onward with that quiet inside him intact. Some truths, he knew now, were meant not to enrich a man, but to test whether he was still worthy of his own silence. The road away from the hidden basin did not ease him of its weight. Each measured step his mule carried him downward seemed to echo faintly against the memory of stone and shadow he had left behind. The mountain did not pursue him. It did not whisper. It did not accuse. It merely resumed its indifference, as it had after those other men had prayed and cut and vanished. And beneath that vast stillness, he understood fully that the true reckoning had not occurred in the mind's depth, but in the quiet decision to walk away from it. He traveled without hurry through the lower draws, following timberlines and shallow creeks as they bent back toward known ground. The world widened again, its open sky restored, the pale horizon stretching with deceptive gentleness toward places men still named progress. Somewhere far behind him, silver lay sleeping, and above it the cross still clung faintly.